The frozen landscape of eastern Russia in the winter of 1941 to 1942 bore witness to the transformation of German military fortunes from the triumphant advances of Operation Barbarossa's opening months to the grinding defensive battles that marked the first major strategic failure of Hitler's military leadership, as the Wehrmacht forces that had driven to the gates of Moscow found themselves not entering the Soviet capital in triumph, but rather retreating under pressure from Soviet counteroffensives that demonstrated the Red Army was not destroyed, that the Soviet state was not collapsing, and that the campaign Hitler had confidently predicted would end in weeks or months had instead become a war of attrition that Germany could not win. The recognition that the Eastern Front was doomed to eventual German defeat came to Adolf Hitler not in a single moment of dramatic realization, but through the accumulation of evidence across the years 1942 through 1944, as each German offensive achieved less than promised, as each Soviet counteroffensive recovered more territory, as the casualty ratios shifted inexorably toward the disadvantage of German forces, and as the industrial production and manpower advantages of the Soviet Union began to manifest in ways that no amount of German tactical brilliance could overcome. The first clear indication that Operation Barbarossa had failed in its strategic objectives came with the inability to capture Moscow before winter and the subsequent Soviet counteroffensive in December 1941 that drove German forces back from the capital and inflicted the first major strategic defeat on the Wehrmacht. General Georgy Zhukov's offensive operations around Moscow demonstrated that Soviet forces retained offensive capability despite catastrophic losses in the campaign's opening months, that Soviet reserves from Siberia and Central Asia were arriving to replace destroyed units, and that the Red Army was learning from its defeats and adapting tactics to counter German operational methods. Hitler's response to these setbacks was to issue orders forbidding retreat, to demand that every position be held regardless of tactical circumstances, and to attribute failures to insufficient will among commanders rather than to the fundamental reality that German forces lacked the strength to achieve the objectives assigned to them. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center during the advance on Moscow, had warned Hitler that German forces were exhausted, that supply lines were overextended, that the objectives assigned were beyond the capabilities of the forces available, and that continuing the offensive into winter would risk catastrophic defeat. Von Bock's warnings, like those of other professional military officers who understood operational realities, were dismissed by Hitler as defeatism, as evidence of insufficient commitment to National Socialist ideals of will triumphing over material circumstances. The relief of von Bock and other commanders who had expressed concerns about operational feasibility established the pattern that would characterize German command arrangements on the Eastern Front through the remainder of the war. Commanders who told Hitler what he wanted to hear were retained, while those who provided realistic assessments of operational challenges were dismissed or ignored. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, compiled statistical analyses of German and Soviet force levels, casualty rates, and replacement capabilities that should have made clear to Hitler that the mathematical trajectory of the Eastern Front campaign favored the Soviet Union, that German forces were being consumed faster than replacements could arrive, and that Soviet losses, while far higher in absolute numbers, were being replaced by mobilization and production that Germany could not match. Halder's presentations of these analyses to Hitler through 1942 were met with dismissal of the statistics as defeatist, with insistence that German fighting quality would overcome Soviet numerical advantages, and with orders to plan summer offensives that would achieve the decisive victory that had eluded German forces in 1941. The German summer offensive of 1942, designated Case Blue and aimed at capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city of Stalingrad on the Volga, represented Hitler's attempt to achieve strategic objectives that would offset the failure to defeat the Soviet Union in 1941. The campaign was based on the assumption that Soviet military power had been sufficiently weakened by the 1941 battles that German forces could achieve decisive operational success in the south, even while maintaining defensive positions along the remainder of the Eastern Front. This assumption reflected Hitler's continued belief that one more offensive, one more operational success would break Soviet resistance and achieve the collapse of the communist state that had been predicted in the original Barbarossa planning. Field Marshal Wilhelm List, commanding Army Group A during the Caucasus Offensive, reported to Hitler that his forces were inadequate for the objectives assigned, that German logistics could not sustain simultaneous drives towards both the oil fields and Stalingrad across the vast distances of southern Russia, and that splitting German strength between multiple objectives would prevent achievement of any of them. List's professional military assessment, which reflected the consensus view of experienced field commanders, was rejected by Hitler, who insisted that German forces were adequate for both objectives if properly led, and who attributed concerns about feasibility to lack of offensive spirit. List's subsequent relief from command in September 1942 confirmed that Hitler would not tolerate military advice that contradicted his strategic vision. The catastrophe at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 to 1943, where the entire German Sixth Army was encircled and destroyed with the loss of approximately 300,000 soldiers killed or captured, should have provided Hitler with undeniable evidence that the Eastern Front was doomed without fundamental changes in German strategy. The destruction of one of Germany's finest armies, the first surrender of a German field marshal in history, and the public revelation that the Wehrmacht was not invincible, all represented consequences that transcended the immediate operational significance and should have forced reconsideration of whether Germany could achieve its objectives in the East through continued offensive operations. General Kurt Zeitzler, who had replaced Halder as Chief of the Army General Staff in September 1942, argued throughout the Stalingrad battle for authorizing the Sixth Army to break out of the encirclement while it still possessed mobility and supplies, warning that remaining in place guaranteed the army's destruction. Hitler's rejection of these recommendations, his insistence that Stalingrad be held regardless of cost, and his reliance on Hermann Göring's false promises that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled army by air, all demonstrated that operational decisions were being driven by political and psychological considerations rather than by military realism. The lesson of Stalingrad was that Hitler's interference in operations produced catastrophic results, but the lesson Hitler drew was that commanders had failed to display sufficient determination, rather than that his own strategic decisions were flawed. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group Don during the failed relief for Stalingrad and later commanding Army Group South during the defensive battles of 1943, provided Hitler with assessments of the Eastern Front that attempted to convey the reality that German forces were inadequate for the strategic objectives Hitler demanded, and that defensive operations offering space for time and inflicting disproportionate casualties on Soviet offensives represented Germany's only realistic option for avoiding complete catastrophe. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943, Germany's last major offensive operation on the Eastern Front, demonstrated that Soviet defensive preparations and material superiority had reached levels that made German breakthrough operations impossible, even when German forces concentrated their best units and newest equipment for the attack.
Operation Citadel, the offensive at Kursk, was launched despite warnings from field commanders that Soviet defenses were too strong, that the operation was too predictable, and that German armor strength was inadequate for achieving breakthrough against prepared positions supported by extensive minefields and anti-tank weapons. The failure at Kursk, where German forces were defeated in the war's largest tank battle and were forced to transition permanently to defensive operations, marked the point where any remaining hope for German strategic initiative on the Eastern Front was extinguished. General Heinz Guderian, recalled from retirement to serve as Inspector General of Armored Troops in 1943, provided Hitler with detailed assessments of German tank strength and production compared to Soviet capabilities, demonstrating that the ratio of forces was shifting decisively against Germany, that Soviet tank production exceeded German output by factors of 3 or 4, and that the qualitative advantages German armor had enjoyed in earlier campaigns were being negated by Soviet introduction of tanks like the T-34 and heavy tanks like the IS-2 that matched or exceeded German capabilities. Guderian's recommendations for defensive operations that would husband German armor strength rather than expending it in costly offensives were acknowledged but not implemented, with Hitler insisting that offensive operations were necessary to maintain initiative and to demonstrate to Germany's allies that the Reich retained the capacity for decisive action. The Soviet offensive operations of 1943 and 1944, following the German defeat at Kursk, progressively drove German forces westward, liberating Soviet territory that had been occupied since 1941, demonstrating operational capabilities that rivaled or exceeded the Wehrmacht's performance in earlier campaigns, and imposing casualties that Germany could not replace. While Soviet losses were being made good through mobilization and industrial production, Operation Bagration in June 1944, the Soviet offensive in Belarus, timed to coincide with the Allied invasion of Normandy, destroyed Army Group Center and inflicted losses comparable to Stalingrad, demonstrating that Soviet forces could now conduct the kind of deep operations that German forces had pioneered but could no longer execute due to resource constraints. Field Marshal Walter Model, who earned a reputation as a defensive specialist through his ability to stabilize sectors threatened by Soviet breakthroughs, provided Hitler with detailed assessments of German situation while carefully framing recommendations that might be acceptable to the Führer. Model understood that Hitler would not accept advice framed as defeatist, that recommendations needed to emphasize continued resistance and promise eventual counterattacks, even when the operational reality was purely defensive. Model's success in maintaining Hitler's confidence while conducting realistic operations reflected his understanding of how to work within the constraints of the Nazi command system. But even Model could not prevent the progressive deterioration of German defensive capabilities as casualties accumulated and replacements proved inadequate. The question of when exactly Hitler learned or acknowledged that the Eastern Front was doomed admits no simple answer, because the Führer's capacity for self-deception, his ideological conviction that will could overcome material disadvantages, and his unwillingness to accept advice that contradicted his strategic vision, all prevented him from ever fully acknowledging that the war in the East was lost. Evidence accumulated through 1942, 1943, and 1944 that should have made the conclusion inescapable: the catastrophe at Stalingrad, the failure at Kursk, the progressive Soviet advances that liberated occupied territory, the casualty rates that were consuming German divisions, and the industrial production statistics that showed Soviet advantages in every category of military equipment. Yet Hitler continued to speak of eventual victory, of new weapons that would change the balance, of political developments that would fracture the Allied coalition, and of German determination that would outlast Soviet offensive capacity. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, presented Hitler with detailed comparisons of German and Soviet industrial output that demonstrated the fundamental imbalance in productive capacity, showing Soviet tank production of 30,000 units per year compared to German production of 6,000, Soviet artillery production that exceeded German output by similar ratios, and Soviet aircraft production that was rebuilding the Red Air Force faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy Soviet planes. These statistics, compiled from intelligence reports and analyzed by German economic experts, should have made clear that Germany was fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity could replace losses and expand forces, while German production struggled to maintain existing force levels. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister who maintained close contact with Hitler throughout the war, recorded in his diary observations about the Führer's state of mind regarding the Eastern Front, noting that Hitler alternated between periods of depression when confronted with bad news and periods of unrealistic optimism when discussing future operations or potential political developments. Goebbels observed that Hitler seemed unable or unwilling to accept that the war in the East had become unwinnable, that the Führer clung to hopes for wonder weapons, for Allied political divisions, for some miracle that would reverse German fortunes, despite all evidence suggesting such hopes were fantasies. The military conferences at Hitler's headquarters in 1943 and 1944 became increasingly surreal as the gap between Hitler's demands and operational realities widened, with the Führer issuing orders for counteroffensives by armies that lacked the strength for such operations, demanding defense of every meter of territory when mobile defense might have imposed higher costs on Soviet advances, rejecting operational plans that acknowledged the weakness of German positions in favor of directives that assumed resources and capabilities that no longer existed. General Adolf Hitler, chief of the operations department of the Army General Staff, participated in these conferences and observed that Hitler's detachment from reality was becoming total, that the maps and force assessments used in planning bore increasingly little relationship to actual conditions at the front. Field Marshal Walter Model, who earned a reputation as a defensive specialist through his ability to stabilize sectors threatened by Soviet breakthroughs, provided Hitler with operational assessments that emphasized the deteriorating German situation, while carefully framing recommendations in ways that might be acceptable to the Führer. Model understood that Hitler would not accept advice framed as defeatist, that recommendations needed to emphasize continued resistance and promise eventual counterattacks, even when the operational reality was purely defensive. Model's success in maintaining Hitler's confidence while conducting realistic operations reflected his understanding of how to work within the constraints of the Nazi command system. But even Model could not prevent the progressive deterioration of German defensive capabilities as casualties accumulated and replacements proved inadequate.
The Soviet offensive operations of late 1944 and early 1945 drove German forces out of the Soviet Union entirely and into Poland, Romania, Hungary, and eventually Germany itself, with Soviet armies advancing with a momentum that made clear the Red Army was not simply recovering lost territory, but was capable of invading and conquering Germany if resistance continued. The scale of these operations, the coordination among multiple Soviet fronts, and the logistical support that sustained offensives across hundreds of miles all demonstrated that Soviet military capability had evolved from the desperate defensive operations of 1941 to become the most powerful military force in Europe, one that Germany had no realistic prospect of defeating. General Gotthard Heinrizi, commanding armies in the East during the war's final year, provided assessments to Hitler that attempted to convey the hopelessness of the military situation, the inadequacy of German forces for the missions assigned, and the necessity of withdrawal if German military power was to be preserved for any coherent defensive operations. Heinrizi, like other commanders who maintained their positions into the war's final phase, learned to frame recommendations in ways that avoided explicit acknowledgement of inevitable defeat while still attempting to implement operations that reflected military realism rather than Hitler's fantasies. Hitler's final military conferences in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin during April 1945, with Soviet forces fighting through the city's streets, saw the Führer still issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, planning relief operations with forces that had been destroyed weeks earlier, refusing to acknowledge that the Eastern Front had not merely been defeated, but had ceased to exist as a coherent military entity. The delusion that characterized these final conferences represented the culmination of years of refusing to accept that the war in the East was unwinnable, that the Eastern Front had been doomed since at least the failure at Kursk and arguably since the catastrophe at Stalingrad. The reasons why Hitler never explicitly acknowledged that the Eastern Front was doomed included his ideological conviction that will could overcome material disadvantages, his personal investment in the campaign as the centerpiece of his strategic vision for German expansion, his fear that acknowledging inevitable defeat would undermine German morale and provide propaganda victories to enemies, and his personality characteristics that made admission of error psychologically difficult. The pattern established in the campaign's early days, where Hitler attributed setbacks to insufficient determination rather than to strategic or operational errors, continued through the war's final days, as Hitler blamed generals for defeats that resulted from his own decisions. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schorner, one of Hitler's most loyal commanders, who remained fighting in Czechoslovakia even after Berlin had fallen, represented the kind of ideologically reliable officer Hitler preferred over professionally competent commanders who questioned the Führer's decisions. Schorner's forces continued operations after Hitler's suicide, maintaining the fiction that resistance served some purpose, even when Germany's defeat was complete and unconditional surrender was merely a matter of negotiating the specific terms and timing. The strategic consequences of Hitler's refusal to acknowledge that the Eastern Front was doomed included the consumption of German military power in operations that could not achieve meaningful objectives, the continued deaths of German soldiers in battles that served no strategic purpose, the destruction of German cities by Soviet advances that might have been slowed or mitigated by more realistic defensive strategies, and the eventual Soviet occupation of Central Europe that shaped the post-war settlement. Whether earlier acceptance that the Eastern Front was unwinnable would have led Hitler to seek negotiated settlement is unknowable, but his refusal to acknowledge reality ensured that Germany fought on until completely defeated, rather than seeking political solutions while some German military power remained. The generals who survived the war and who faced interrogation by Allied intelligence officers or who wrote memoirs about their experiences consistently argued that the Eastern Front had been doomed since at least Stalingrad, and possibly since the failure to capture Moscow in 1941, that professional military officers had recognized this reality and had attempted to convey it to Hitler, and that the Führer's refusal to accept professional military advice had resulted in catastrophic operational decisions that magnified the costs of eventual defeat. These post-war accounts serve partly to absolve the generals of responsibility for Germany's defeat by attributing decisions to Hitler's overruling of their professional judgment, but they also captured the genuine frustration of military professionals who understood military realities but lacked the authority to implement necessary measures. The story of when Hitler learned that the Eastern Front was doomed is ultimately a story about ideological blindness preventing recognition of military reality, about how personal investment in strategic vision can prevent leaders from acknowledging that their plans have failed, about how totalitarian command systems that punish bearers of bad news create information environments where leaders cannot receive accurate assessments even when such assessments are desperately needed. Hitler received abundant evidence that the Eastern Front was doomed, from statistical analyses of force ratios to operational reports of defeats to strategic assessments from Germany's most capable commanders, but he never accepted this evidence because accepting it would have required acknowledging that his fundamental strategic vision for Germany's future was unachievable, that Operation Barbarossa had been a catastrophic error, and that the war he had started would end not in German triumphs, but in German destruction.